Hello and welcome back to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about something called interest. And to kick things off nice and easy, we're going to talk about something called simple interest. So, without any further delay, let's get into it. So, when we talk about interest, what we're really talking about here is the cost of money. Not the cost of making money, but the cost of borrowing money, actually. So, this slide is going to throw a bunch of terminology at you. So, here we go. A loan. A loan, simply put, is an agreement between two parties, a borrower and a lender. So a borrower borrows money, the lender lends money. Easy enough. Now, the first term that you probably haven't heard of is the term principal. By the way, that's principal, P-A-L, not P-L-E. Principal is the original amount borrowed or lent, right? Not borrowed or lent, borrowed and lent, right? The borrower borrows, the lender lends. But this is the original amount. So let's say I asked you for $1. Hey, can I borrow $1? That would be the principal. So that's principal. That's the original amount borrowed. Now, you might say, sure, you can borrow $1, Clark. And I'd say, hey, thank you. But you're going to say, well, not so fast. Because if I'm lending you $1 for a certain amount of time, that means I don't have that dollar to use. Well, what if I want to use $1? Essentially, you're going to charge me a fee in order to borrow that money, which is fair because, again, if you had that dollar, you could be using it for something. Because you're lending it to me, now you can't use it for something. So essentially, you're going to charge me money for the privilege of borrowing your money. So you're going to charge me what's called interest. Interest is a fee paid to borrow money. Now, again, I borrowed $1 from you and you charged me interest. That interest, what might it be? It might be like a nickel, right? You'd say, okay, Clark, you can borrow $1 of mine, but when you give me that dollar back, not only do I want that dollar, the principal, I want 5 cents, a nickel here, in interest. So essentially, when I have to pay you back, I would pay you $1.05. $1 is the principal, 5 cents is the interest in this loan. And that's something that we would agree on ahead of time. It's not like I would borrow $1 from you and pay you back and you'd be like, oh yeah, by the way, you owe me interest too, right? A loan is an agreement at the time that the money is lent, or at least it should be. So who does what? Well, let's just break this down because this is like the number one thing sometimes the students get confused about when we're dealing with interest. Borrowers pay interest, right? So in the example that I laid out, I'm the borrower, I borrowed $1 from you. I need to pay you that nickel. So that's the interest. So the borrower is the one that pays the interest. The lender, of course, then, is the one who earns the interest. If you lent me $1, then you're earning that nickel, right? That's the interest that you earned. And so you have to remember who does what. The borrowers pay interest, the lenders earn interest. If you're thinking like bank accounts and stuff right now, don't get there yet. We're going to talk about that down the road in another video. Just remember right now, borrowers pay interest, lenders earn interest. So borrowers don't like interest at all. Lenders love interest. So here's the next term possibly for you. This is like slightly out of order. Sorry about that. All right, so the term. The term is the time life of the loan. This is another thing that's part of the loan, part of the agreement at the outset here. So if I say, hey, can I borrow $1? I'll pay you back tomorrow. The term of that loan is 1 day. If I say, hey, can I borrow $1? I'll pay you back in a year. The term of the loan is 1 year. So the term is just the time the loan is outstanding. And the final thing you need to know here is the term maturity. Maturity is just the date, like the calendar date at which all principal and interest are due to the lender. So again, if I said, hey, let me borrow $1 from you, I'll pay you back tomorrow, the maturity date, that's tomorrow. Okay, so that's when the principal and the interest are due, is the due date. So you might want to write down those terms if you think you're going to forget them, but they are very important because when we deal with finance and money and interest and all of this kind of stuff, there's a language that goes along with it. And if you don't know these, you're going to be confused. And before you think to yourself, well, I'm not going into banking, I'm good. If you ever are borrowing money to go to college, to buy a house, to buy a car, these are loans. You need to know these terms because this is how the contracts are written. And if you don't understand what you're agreeing to, then you're not making a very good decision. So here we go. We're going to talk about interest rates. Interest rates are essentially telling the borrower how much interest they're going to have to pay and telling the lender how much interest they're going to earn But when we do interest rates, we're expressing them as percentages of the amount borrowed. In other words, percentages of the principal. So we'll do an example of this. Let's imagine that Paul borrows $100 from John, of course, with a 20% simple interest rate for 1 year. So Paul says to John, hey, can I borrow $100? I will pay you 20% interest. I'm going to pay you back that money in a year. The question I have for you is how much will Paul owe John on the maturity date? Right? 1 year from now, how much money does Paul need to send to John? And the answer is $120. Let's think about why. $100 is the principal, right? That's the original amount borrowed. So of course that's due back. And $20 in interest. Where did we get $20 from? Well, 20 is 20% of 100. In other words, we just multiplied $100 times 20%, and that gave us $20. So the principal and the interest together make 120. That's how much money Paul is going to owe John at the end of the term. So we could actually do more stuff with this. We can put this into a formula, which is what we're going to do next. So this coming at you is the formula for simple interest calculations. Definitely want to write this down because we're going to get some practice with it. So here it is. P parentheses 1 plus R close parentheses equals A, where P means principal, the original amount borrowed / lent. R, the lowercase r has to be lowercase here, means the interest rate. When we do this formula, by the way, we write it as a decimal. So you wouldn't write 20%, you'd write 0.2. And A means the final amount, meaning how much needs to be paid back at the end of the term. Now, order of operations really matters here quite a bit, so make sure you have your parentheses, because whatever is inside of the parentheses is what you need to do first, or you can also use the distributive property as well. So let's put our example into this too. So Paul borrows $100 from John with a 20% interest rate. Plugging everything in, oh yeah, there's the principal. Plugging everything in, that's $100 multiplied by parentheses 1 plus 0.2, there's our 20% rate as a decimal, equals 120, right? So if you were to distribute that 100, you would do 100 times 1, and that would give you 100, plus 100 times 0.2, which is 20. So in other words, if you distributed that out, it would just look like this, and it would give you that answer. Alternatively, if you want to, you can just figure out what's in the parentheses first, and that would look like, yeah, we got that. That would look like this, right? 1 plus 0.2 is 1.2, and 100 times 1.2 equals 120. Doesn't really matter how you get there. The important thing to know is how much is going to be owed in the end here, right? So you've got $100 in principal that's owed, and then you've got $20 in interest that's owed as well. And again, who owes that? Paul. John is the one that earns that. Okay, so what if this were multiple years? In other words, what if Paul didn't just borrow from John for 1 year? What if it was like 2 years? Let's imagine Paul borrows $100 from John for 2 years with a 20% annual simple interest rate. Annual just means once a year. Well, all you have to do in that situation is use the same formula, but just add an extra R inside of the parentheses, right? So let's think about what these things mean. Mathematically, the 1 stands for the principal. Why? Well, because the P is the principal, and you're doing P times 1. So that's P times 1 is always going to be P, right? So the 1 in here represents the principal. The R represents the interest rate from year 1, and the second R represents the interest rate from year 2. So again, if we were to go ahead and distribute this, right, it would look, if we were to plug everything in, it would look like this. If we go and distribute that, P times 1 is 100, P times R is 20, P times R is 20. So we have 100, 20, 20, 140. Well, what do these numbers mean again? 100 stands for the principal. That's the amount owed that was originally borrowed. This is the interest from year 1, right? The $20 from year 1. And then this would be the interest from year 2. We're not compounding anything here. If you already know about compounding, we're just using simple interest. So at the end of that 2 years, Paul would owe John $140 altogether. That's the total amount. Again, if it's easier for you, you can just work within the parentheses first. 1 plus zero point 0.2 plus zero point 0.2 is 1.4, and 100 times 1.4 equals 140. If you want to distribute it, that's fine. If you want to combine stuff in the parentheses first, that's fine too. So one of the things, again, that students get confused about the most is straightening out who is who and who wants what in these situations. So I made this little slide about it. Who wants what? Well, the borrower wants a low interest rate. They want the interest rate to be as low as possible. Why? Well, because they pay interest, right? They don't want a 20% or a 50% interest rate. They'd like a 2% interest rate or a 5% interest rate. Something nice and low because they're the ones who have to pay the interest. The lender, on the other hand, wants a high interest rate because they're the ones who are going to earn the interest. They'd much rather have a 20% or a 50% interest rate because they're getting that money. So if this sounds a little familiar, right? Borrowers want low prices, lenders want high prices. That's because an interest rate is really a price. It's just a price. It's not actually that complicated. It's just the price of a service. What service? Well, borrowing money, right? And so borrowers are the buyers of this service. They like low prices. Buyers like low prices. They like low interest rates. Lenders, because they're the ones selling this service, well, they want a high price for the service. They want a high interest rate because that's all interest rates really are. They're just the price of borrowing money. We just have a special term for them, and that's all. So that was a little bit about simple interest. Thank you for watching.